based on that answer, whether
Yep.
that's good or it's bad.
Yeah, it is, it's just reality.
And so now, yeah, we've created rich environment. They decoy, and that's the cool part.
go live like automatically when the software is connected. Okay.
Do you need your mic?
I do, but we have 3 minutes yet.
Okay.
So just wanted to get it started in case there's any technical issues that we need to work out. Which there won't be this time. Hey, quiet in front.
Is everything I say now being captured?
Probably. It's going live, I think. Are you seeing it, Kip? Okay, so everything looks
Are you
good.
hearing me?
I can turn the audio on, but I don't think it's gonna sound like anything.
There will be an echo.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear the ambient noise of the room, yes.
Okay.
The shuffling papers.
In a minute. There we go. Okay, it's 5 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll hold on to the mic just to make sure everybody can hear me well enough. So first of all, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to everybody in the room for joining us, and thank you to our YouTube audience. I'd like to welcome you to the Art of Waterbird and Wetland Management, our spring seminar series hosted by the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. My name is Jennifer Summers. I'm the outreach specialist with the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife, and I am here to tell you more about our series and to welcome you. So this is the full lineup of this spring seminar series. This is the second to last seminar in this series. So we have Taylor Finger today, and next week we have Rebecca Knight, who is a wildlife biologist, wildlife artist, and she was the runner-up, second place winner of the federal duck stamp competition in the most recent duck stamp competition in 2024. Extremely accomplished artist, and she's going to be talking about her experience as a wildlife artist and her experience with the stamp competition. So please come check that out. It's going to be a really interesting talk, and she's a very, very talented artist. So I'd like to take a moment to thank everybody who helped put this series together. First of all, thanks to everybody in the College of Natural Resources. Wisconsin Center for Wildlife is part of the College of Natural Resources, but they often help us with promotions. We use their access to their YouTube channel to record and disseminate these seminars, and they help us in many other ways. So thank you to everybody in the CNR office for their assistance. I'd also like to mention and say thank you to UW Extension. We are a UW Extension organization in parts, as our director is a part extension specialist. And then I'd also like to thank some faculty here at UW-Stevens Point, particularly Ben Settinger, who is our waterfowl specialist and wildlife professor. He helped to identify speakers and helped to come up with some ideas and pull this seminar series together. So special thanks to him, and also thanks to Marie Perkins, who is a wildlife professor here at Point as well, and she does work with shorebirds and marsh birds as well. So she also assisted in identifying speakers and bringing those speakers here to campus. So special thanks to both of those folks for making this seminar series happen. And finally, an important acknowledgement that I would like to go through that we here at UW-Stevens Point do with an agreement with our local tribes. The University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point exists upon land inhabited by the original indigenous people of this area, including the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and the many other nations and groups that predate colonial borders. We acknowledge that with colonialization, Native American people have been dispossessed of their lands and irreparably changed by the actions of individuals and institutions. We acknowledge our responsibility to understand and respond to those actions. In partnership with the Native American Center, we commit to working together to honor the past, be intentional in the present, and build our future with truth. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Our speaker's name is Taylor Fenger, and Taylor is a game bird specialist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources in the Bureau of Wildlife, and he's been with the DNR for over 10 years. He received his bachelor's degree here at UW-Stevens Point, and his master's degree from the University of Western Ontario, where his research focused on lesser scaup migration using satellite telemetry. Taylor has worked with waterfowl across the United States and Canada during his career. He was born and raised in central Wisconsin, and that is where he currently resides. So without further ado, welcome Taylor.
I'll do it this way.
You got it?
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all for being here. I know this is maybe not necessarily the most exciting thing on a Thursday evening, but I appreciate you all being here. I'm going to be covering Wisconsin waterfowl habitat conservation strategy and the decision support tool and how we use that to manage waterfowl in Wisconsin. So again, first I do have to do some acknowledgments. Shamelessly stole many of these slides from Dr. Amy Shipley, who was able to provide that for us. Jay Winarski, who really has helped a lot with the implementation of our decision support tool, Dr. Drew Fowler, Dr. Matt Palumbo, Dr. Jake Straub, Jason Fleener, who is our wetland ecologist within the Wisconsin DNR, our Migratory Game Bird Committee, who all helped develop this conservation strategy, and the Upper Mississippi River Great Lakes Region Joint Venture. So just to elaborate a little bit more on who I am, so I am the Wisconsin DNR game bird ecologist, and as was stated, I was sitting in these chairs 15 years ago, so it's been quite some time now, but I am a waterfowl migratory bird biologist by practice and by experience, and have been for the last 7 years with the DNR, but I recently obtained some new responsibilities in upland game, so I also manage turkeys, I manage pheasants, I manage small game, dog training, dog trialing, and then some responsibilities with ruffed grouse and sharp-tailed grouse and other upland birds. So needless to say, if you ask me questions about waterfowl, I will actually know what I'm talking about. If you ask me questions about those other things, I will probably lie to you confidently. So either way, again, my roles and responsibilities are statewide management. I develop the hunting season structures. I talk to most of our hunters out there. I also fly the waterfowl surveys, get out there, capture turkeys. We're putting transmitters on those birds. So try to get out of the office as much as possible, but in reality, I probably manage more people than I do actually the resources. So with that, I'm going to dig into, again, the waterfowl habitat conservation strategy, as well as what the decision support tool is within that strategy. And so this decision support tool essentially allows us to incorporate ongoing land use, climate change, and how that threatens biodiversity. We also use it to strategically try to protect different parts of our ecosystem and biodiversity. And then what the decision support tool, and again, I'll get into exactly what that is, it allows us to prioritize where we need to be doing work and habitat management within the state of Wisconsin. So I'm going to go into the Wayback Machine here and talk about some of the waterfowl habitat management in the state of Wisconsin. So predating the Department of Natural Resources was the Wisconsin Conservation Department. And beginning in the 1930s, we took on the role of managing impoundments and dams. And during that time period, we didn't have any geographical decision support tool. So essentially, we were doing what we were told to do and where we felt we needed to do the work. Then starting in the 1960s, and I'll touch base on this in a couple of bullet points here, we began sending funding to Canada. And again, the reasoning behind that is The vast majority of the birds in North America are produced in the prairie pothole region of Canada, and a lot of them migrate through the state of Wisconsin, which provide opportunities for our hunters. So only doing habitat management work here in Wisconsin isn't necessarily going to benefit all of the waterfowl that we see on an annual basis. So beginning in 1978, there was a state law that essentially started the Wisconsin waterfowl stamp, and we had identified dedicated funding. And within that state law, it was identified that 1/3 of all of the money from the state duck stamp goes to Canada, and 2/3 stays within the state. And so again, for example, this year, we're going through a process with our waterfowl stamp funding where we're going to have roughly $1.8 million over the next biennium to spend on work both here in Wisconsin as well as Canada. And so the interesting thing here is, again, since 1978, we've been spending lots of money on waterfowl management, but we didn't necessarily have something that was solid or justifiable in terms of using data or information to say where we should be spending that money. We use an anecdotal information, expertise, but we felt that this is something that we needed to take the next step on. So fortunately for waterfowl, compared to a lot of species that we have in North America, we have both continental, regional, and in the sense of Wisconsin, we have management plans. And so the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, we then can step that down to the Upper Mississippi River Great Lakes Region Joint Venture Plan, and I'll elaborate on this. And interestingly, Wisconsin, then and currently, is still the only state to step down one of those regional plans into a management effort within state. And so, touching base on the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, I'm not going to get too crazy on it, but it was a management plan that was developed in 1986 and signed on by the United States and Canada, and then Mexico joined several years later. And the whole strategy of the original plan was to restore waterfowl populations through habitat protection, restoration, and enhancement. And then the NAWMP plan has gone through several revisions, and in the most recent revision, we added people into the management plan because ultimately they are the source of funding, and you have to pay attention to how we manage that resource because ultimately that affects our ability to increase waterfowl populations as well as protect habitat. And so that goal in 1991 was essentially to establish a continental breeding population of 62,000 with a fall flight, 62 million with a fall flight of 100 million. And so how we implement the North American Waterfowl Management Plan is through these joint ventures. And joint ventures are a collaborative process between federal entities, state entities, provincial governments, tribal governments, businesses, conservation organizations, and then just individuals are all part of these joint venture efforts. And so here in North America, we have 22 habitat-based joint ventures. We are in the purple one, well, you can see it up there. We're in the Upper Mississippi River Great Lakes Joint Venture. And so this is the area that we have. It is really important as it relates to waterfowl, particularly within the Mississippi Flyway, just because we do have unique habitat, and it's a key area for millions of waterfowl for staging, but we also do produce quite a few mallards, blue-winged teal, wood ducks, Canada geese. And so it's the nation's only inland coastal area with the Great Lakes shorelines. It's also the world's largest freshwater delta at Lake St. Clair. Floodplains in terms of 4 major rivers are within this region. And those BCRs, or bird conservation regions, they really covered the gamut of all types of different habitats, which is important in terms of the diversity of birds that we see within this region. And so, again, stepping down from the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, the Upper Mississippi River Great Lakes Joint Venture said we need to create one specific to our region. And so again, that plan essentially was to guide habitat conservation in terms of trying to increase or maintain specific populations or focal species of waterfowl, as well as making them consistent with societal and continental goals, and then permanently trying to protect at least 3 million acres of private or public land and 2 million acres of habitat on private land. So, again, highlighting that Wisconsin was, in 1992, and still is 30 plus years later, the only state to step down a regional plan into something that we could do on a state-specific scale. And so Jim March in 1992, Jim actually still comes to the public hearings and tells me all the things that I should be doing, because that's what he would have done in his day. He's a very gracious man. But he and a group of folks, they identified this Wisconsin plan, which is just a step-down plan, to try to permanently protect over 50,000 acres of habitat, protecting over 110,000 acres of habitat on private lands through short-term agreements. 65,000 acres of habitat on public lands, and try to really boost the amount of waterfowl we have breeding here in the state, as well as what we see in our fall flight by 2005. That was the goal. And again, I can't state enough how important a collaborative process this is, because just a state agency or a federal agency, we can see right now, you know, when one leg of the stool is potentially taking out, it's really important to have those partners to make sure that this process still goes on. And so we had DNR wildlife biologists and managers and researchers, the Fish and Wildlife Service, Ducks Unlimited, the Nature Conservancy, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, Wisconsin Waterfowl Association, the U.S. Forest Service, and U.S. Soil Conservation Service. So again, you can see that basically any way that we were going to manage habitat, there had to be somebody on this group that was going to make sure that we had the expertise to get the job done. And so the step-down plan of the Wisconsin, our original conservation strategy, essentially looked at two different types of habitat. So we focused on breeding habitat, so whether that's pothole wetlands, our streams, what we have in inland lakes, beaver flowages, our own impoundments, as well as migration habitat. So state and federal refuges, the Mississippi River, Green Bay, Lake Michigan, the large Wisconsin river flowages, making sure that, hey, this is where we need to be focusing our work. And that's how we broke this down, was by priority 1 versus priority 2 habitat. And so priority 1 habitat, essentially everywhere that we felt were important for breeding or migration habitat, that's in that dark priority 1 habitat, and outside of that was priority 2, and we focused all of our work within that gray area because that's where we felt the biggest bang for our buck would be in terms of actual habitat management and increasing waterfowl populations. So the next step is that we identified within that priority 1 habitat these 9 focal areas that we said, okay, how can we break this down a little bit more? And then using political boundaries, we went through each one of these counties, each one of these focal areas, and looked at township level and said which township is a priority township, because not everywhere, you know, in every county that is a spot. I mean, for example, if you look on there, Milwaukee, everywhere around Milwaukee is a priority 1, but Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee, is, you know, we're not going to do much in terms of managing habitat in the city of Milwaukee to improve waterfowl numbers. So we broke this down, went through every single one of these townships, and how we did that was Jim March, John Berquist, folks sitting around with probably a couple adult beverages, and said, do we think that this is where we should be doing work? Then they would go to the county biologist and say, hey, are we right? Are we wrong? It was really just expert opinion. And quite frankly, they did a really good job for 30 years of spending money in those areas. Again, their expert opinion was pretty spot on when we actually get and look at some of the stuff that we're doing now. But ultimately, we have better data now. And so, with that being the case, fast forward 30 years, the idea was that we needed to potentially update this Wisconsin plan. We have way more data, we have more technology. It's just what's out there and available was something that we felt we could implement. And so Jason Fleener, our wetland ecologist, worked with Dr. Jake Straub here at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, who Jake held the position before Ben Zedinger. And they said, hey, let's recreate the wheel. We're going to use this, but we got to take a step back, and we really got to holistically look at what we're going to do. And so they hired Dr. Matt Palumbo as a postdoc and said, will you create this decision support tool or this model that will ultimately tell us where we should be doing work rather than, you know, this township or that township. Let's get together. They sat down with the migratory committee. We had probably half a dozen meetings where we said, okay, what's the data we have? Is it good data? Is it bad data? How can we move forward? What are the sources of information that we need to incorporate into a model that will ultimately tell us where we should be doing management in Wisconsin? And one of the big things that came out of that is we probably shouldn't be managing at township levels or political boundaries. Rather, we were going to look at ecological landscapes and these HUC 12 watersheds. So again, HUC 12 watershed was more or less a ecological aspect out there that if we do management within that watershed, we ultimately can tell how that's going to impact downstream effects rather than, well, we're in a township. It really doesn't necessarily get at what we wanted to look for. So again, going back, we had the Mississippi River Great Lakes Joint Venture, their strategy, their conservation strategy utilized a decision support tool. And so rather than having to try to recreate our own, we used this as a point of reference for how we wanted to break this down in Wisconsin. And so again, within this tool, it was important that they identify parameters that were ultimately going to tell us where work should be done. And so you can look up on there, within this Great Lakes Joint Venture, they said that we need to focus on where breeding ducks are, where non-breeding ducks, so where they're migrating during the fall and spring migration, where waterfowl hunters are, because ultimately, again, they are the funding source for all the work that we do, outdoor recreation, because recognizing that not everybody is a consumptive user of the resource, and then Gulf hypoxia was a good way to look at ecological goods and services, and then Great Lakes coast, just recognizing how important the coastline is within this region. And then additionally, beside those parameters, they said, well, are they all created equal? And they felt no. So this model at the Great Lakes region said we need to focus on breeding ducks and where migration occurs for these waterfowl. That basically made up 60% of the entire model. And what this did is it gave us this thunderstorm map of where we should be doing work within the region. The red saying this is, if you're going to do work, this is where you should be focusing your work on. And again, interestingly, it's not all that different even at the Great Lakes or joint venture scale from what we saw from the 1992 plan, but it had a lot of data that helped inform this. And we thought, do we have state-specific data to create our own? And we felt we did. So again, each one of those squiggly lines on there is one of those HUC 12 watersheds. And so what we were able to do is pull together all of the parameters that we felt were important to create this map. And so we looked at two different models. We looked at conservation capital, which essentially says this is where we have really good habitat now. We need to make sure that we maintain or improve the wetland habitat that's there. And that's this top model. And then the bottom model is conservation opportunity, which for our partners like Ducks Unlimited or Wisconsin Waterfowl Association, that says, well, what if we break tile? What if we plug a ditch? And it's a farm field. It's not a good wetland now, but if we did it, it could be good wetland. So that's a place that we need to focus maybe our effort to bring wetlands back. And so to inform each one of those models, we had 4 focal species. We had mallards, blue-winged teal, wood ducks, and ringnecks as our 4 primary breeding species within the state. And again, for each one of those species, we had each one of these parameters. So again, recognizing that we had breeding distribution, so again, where I flew the waterfowl survey, and what the information that we got from that, as well as expert opinion, where our fall migration occurs, where our spring migration occurs, again, hunter distribution, and then ecological goods and services. And again, we did the same thing where we ranked them. And with Wisconsin being a high production state, we said we're going to put most of our weight towards breeding distribution of waterfowl here, because again, if we're going to improve wetlands, that's likely what the biggest bang for our buck is for breeding waterfowl. And then with spring distribution or spring migration, as those birds come through before they get to their breeding grounds, we have to make sure that we have high quality wetlands as well. And then for conservation opportunity, breeding habitat potential. So again, where could we have good wetlands that would best benefit waterfowl? Where do we have most of our people? And then in terms of ecological goods and services. So what we did was we took dozen-plus maps, each one of those 4 focal species, each one of those parameters had their own map, and we created a raster layer, and we overlaid it into what we have in terms of steps 7 and 8, and that was there. That's our conservation capital, and then our conservation opportunity, and broken down by those HUC 12 watersheds to get to our aggregate decision support tool. So essentially, this is where we should be doing work to improve teal, wood duck, mallard, ringneck across all the annual cycle. So this is where we need to be focusing in terms of managing waterfowl. This is what we were able to create with this decision support tool. And again, making sure that 9 being red is the most important and 1 being blue is the least important. And how do we use this tool? So I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but just quick, lead into it, is that we use this tool to determine where we spend our Wisconsin waterfowl stamp funds. We use this tool to look at wetland infrastructure. So again, Wisconsin has a lot of dikes, dams, impoundments, and we have to determine where we can use our limited resources in terms of spending money and time to manage those infrastructures. Our external partners, again, the Ducks Unlimited, the Wisconsin Waterfowl Association, the Delta Waterfowl groups, say, okay, where should we be doing work in terms of our funding and what we can be doing, so they use that tool as well. Informing our statewide management plan. So again, I created, fortunately, 2020, we did the Wisconsin Waterfowl Management Plan, and I used this decision support tool to help us determine, can we improve numbers of teal? Can we improve numbers of wood ducks? Can we improve numbers of mallards? And how do we go about doing that? And then from the department, we use this to prioritize, should we be working on emergent wetlands? Should we be working on grassland? Should we be working on certain things? And within which areas of the state can we actually make that happen? And then regionally, you guys saw the model from the Great Lakes Joint Venture that was created in 2017. You'll look at some of the data that we're now incorporating into this tool. They are absolutely going to be using that moving forward, using some of the new data that's available. So making sure that we got it right so that our partners can use it at a larger scale. And I think there was a professor here at Point that told me all models are wrong, just some less so. And so we told ourselves that we needed to go in and look at this decision support tool critically and say, where can we review, where can we assess, where can we validate, and ultimately where can we adjust that decision support tool. So with that being the case, we asked ourselves, we created this in 2020, here we are 5 years later, and if anybody has been tracking technology with regard to management, 5 years seems like 100 years in terms of what's gone on in terms of wildlife management. So with that being the case, again, our problem was, and the same problem in 1992, is where we lacked the data, we used expert opinion. And ultimately, expert opinion doesn't necessarily capture all of the relationships that we could be potentially getting from field data. It's very sensitive to who the expert is and how frequently that expert changes. And then it does likely ignore spatial ecological relationships. So again, just recognizing that it's the best data we had, but can we get new data or new sources of data to help inform that? And so here's just an example of what expert opinion looked like, or expert validation was, is that we used the National Wetland Inventory for wetlands to say, okay, particularly for spring and fall migrations, even during the breeding season, we said, okay, where are the wetlands on the landscape? What type of wetlands are they? What class of wetlands? How close are they to grasslands? Essentially some characteristics that we were able to pull and say, okay, these wetlands are the most important wetlands out of all the wetlands that are out there. And then we could run a kernel density analysis on this to essentially say, okay, this is, of all the wetlands, these are the most important wetlands, and this is the density of those wetlands and how important they are. So again, it's data driven, but it's also expert opinion, because we felt we used our determination to say those wetlands are more important than other wetlands. Well, these are all the layers that we had that we used that expert opinion on in terms of our breeding distribution, our fall migration, and our spring migration. And you can see in terms of weight, they made up the vast majority of the weight. So again, based similar to the 1992 plan, we used a lot of what some folks felt was gut feeling in terms of how we were going to use this model or inform this model. So we had some new folks that came into this and said, why are we not using all of the data available? And so looking at community citizen science and using eBird, which is something that is becoming extremely popular in terms of managing waterfowl across the country. And I can tell you that there were folks in the room that were uneasy, traditional biologists that are like, is this eBird legit? You know, I mean, most folks are, it's not a random process. You don't know who the people are that are providing eBird. But the nice thing about eBird, it's been out there long enough that the amount of data is staggering that comes through there. And the Cornell lab folks have done an amazing job essentially validating or verifying who are good at it. And they can pull that data to essentially say, this is a reliable source of information that you can incorporate into whatever tools that you'd like to do. So for example, this is an eBird map of wood ducks during what we would consider the breeding season. And again, just the amount of data there is unbelievable. And so what we've been able to look at is essentially incorporating this information into our models to essentially look at relative abundance. So rather than us using the habitat density with the National Wetland Inventory that says, okay, here's the wetlands that we think, well, we can use the relative abundance of the birds through the eBird data. We can look at that habitat relationship just specifically from where that data is, not just us saying, well, we think these wetlands are important. We can be like, nope, there's observations of birds on those wetlands. Those are important wetlands. And again, using boosted regression trees, just a much more robust analysis than the kernel density analysis. So how did we do? That was, there was, again, whether or not some folks wanted to see the data of like, oh, well, I think I know better than someone. It's nice to actually have a couple of maps to show how well we did. And so purple is how the experts did, green is how eBird did, and white means we were consistent across those two groups. So fortunately, most of this is white. However, there are areas that we identified as really important that didn't necessarily show up in the eBird data, and the eBird data said areas that were really important that we didn't necessarily find as well. And again, it was different by time of year, and it was different by our focal species. Just a quick highlight, clearly we overestimated the north central part of Wisconsin. There is a ton of wetlands up there, but not as many waterfowl use them. Whereas certain areas of the state, we have not as many wetlands, but they're really critical to where people were seeing birds through the eBird process. So with that being the case, we wanted to make sure that how did this affect our model? And you can see it absolutely did. Not hugely, but you can see there's definitely a muting in that north central part of the state. I would say right here, here in Stevens Point, just south of us in Necedah, that definitely blew up in terms of importance using the eBird data. But I would say in that Fox Valley, Horicon area where we had it as really important, basically every Huck 12 watershed in that area was a 9. It kind of muted that out somewhat. So again, we felt that there were differences between the data, and then it created contrasting priorities in terms of that ranking, that 1 through 9 in terms of our Huck 12 watershed. So ultimately, I believe it's currently in review to get published, but we incorporated this data into our new decision support tool because we felt this information actually reflects what's happening there on the landscape, and it's a source of data we didn't consider 5 years ago, but is something that we feel is fairly accurate. So if we were wrong once, how often can we be wrong? So we did the same exact thing in terms of trying to validate those Huck 12 watersheds. Are they actually good, or are we overestimating their quality? And so there was a study that was developed with Ben Sedinger here to look at the differences in the types of watersheds, and then have Amanda Griswold, recent graduate, master student here, evaluate our 9s, actually 9s, our 7s, our 1s. And through the use of drones, she was able to look at how many pairs we had on those Huck 12 watersheds, as well as brood production. And again, just shout out to the new technology that's out there, and folks in this room that helped with this work as well. The use of thermal cameras on drones has made life so much easier for waterfowl managers, whether that's here in Wisconsin or that's on the Prairie Pothole region. You can just look at these two different pictures and tell which one is a lot easier to identify waterfowl in. And again, just recognizing the ability to have a drone versus, I can tell you when I was a master's student, we were canoeing and kayaking and standing on the beds of trucks with binoculars trying to do this same exact effort. And so, again, through her research, she was able to look at the number of pairs, the amount of broods, and essentially what Amanda found was, yes, high priority wetlands did indeed have higher number of pairs of waterfowl, but there wasn't necessarily a strong association with the number of broods that were on those wetlands. And so I think there's opportunity for additional research, and in my mind, with something that's relatively short as this is, the measure of broods with the amount of variability in wetlands, the amount of, in terms of weather, everything that's out there, I don't necessarily know if the metric of broods is what you need to be looking at. If we can provide really good habitat for breeding pairs, I'm going to guess more times than not, those will result in increased broods. And so, again, finding this has, and then there you go, you can see the ability to take the thermal camera and then zoom down and count the actual birds that are out there. And so, my next step is I fly the waterfowl survey across the state of Wisconsin, and we have come into, the golden age of technology. I was, up until 2 years ago, still writing on a piece of paper with a microphone and recording this and having to go back and listen to myself. We have 30-mile transects. We have over 60 30-mile transects, and the precision of the data that we originally had was, okay, well, there are 7 pairs of mallards on this 30-mile stretch. Well, we now can use the new technology that we have that allows me to hit a button and it records my voice and drops a GPS location for every single observation that I see. And so each one of those circles is an observation of birds or wetlands that I saw through 1 day of flying the plane. And similar to the drone situation is now I can break this down, we can put these GPS locations on a map and look at what wetland types produced or had the most pairs on it, whether that's for mallards, whether that's for blue-winged teal, whether that's for wood ducks. And then I can overlay that with our Huck 12 watershed to say, okay, where are our priority wetlands and how are they associated with where I'm actually counting ducks on the spring waterfowl survey. So again, another method or way for us to validate the data that we have. So I want to get into, in terms of our current management uses, right now I have 42 applications that I need to review by the April 1st of asking for funding. That's just for waterfowl. I have at least 30 for turkey and 20 for pheasant. So yeah, but this is the time of year. We have roughly $1.8 million that we'll allocate over the next 2 years in terms of funding for work that'll be done both here in Wisconsin as well as in the Prairie Pothole region in Canada. The issue is that with all of those 40 plus projects, we have over $3 million in terms of total ask. So we're only able to essentially fund a little over half of all the projects that'll ultimately come in. And so with that kind of money and the importance of all of those projects, we needed a way to prioritize where we spend that money. And so the decision support tool that I've just been yakking about for the last half hour is exactly what goes into our application. You have to tell us which Huck 12 watershed you're in, which ecological landscape you're in, and essentially justify why you're doing work there. And again, we've done really good work for a long time. This allows us transparency as well as strong justification for why we're selecting projects to get funded. And ultimately, making us have this is one of the reasons that we were able to get an increase to our duck stamp fund, or our duck stamp price. We hadn't had one since 1997, and it happened, I believe, in 2022. Because we could clearly say that this is where money's going to, we're prioritizing, we have, again, good justification and transparency in terms of how that money's being spent. As I said, with the Wisconsin Waterfowl Management Plan, I use this in terms of, I said we need to have an increase in blue-winged teal population by 10% over the next 10 years. Same thing with wood ducks, same thing with mallards. Well, how do we actually get an increase in those populations? And that is through identifying where we need to be doing critical work, where we need to be retaining and restoring emergent wetlands or grasslands or forested wetlands. So again, working closely with our biologists to say, okay, do you want teal? I get the question, Grand River Marsh. We have an awesome wetland complex, but we think, we produce a lot of teal. How can we produce more teal? Okay, well here, are you guys in a priority landscape? Are you in a priority Huck 12 watershed? Yes, you are. Okay, let's figure out how to put money towards that to ultimately improve what we're seeing on the landscape. And then lastly, in terms of what's been huge on our end, and again, similar thing, we get questions from legislators, we get questions from decision makers that says, where are you spending your money and why? And our wetland infrastructure review has been a huge lift over the last 4 years in terms of, we have roughly 200 miles of dikes that we manage, which is Green Bay to Minneapolis. In terms of total number of dikes, we have over 1,100 impoundments. And so we have a limited number of staff, we have a limited number of resources, and the vast majority of those dikes and impoundments were created in the 60s and 70s. And so now here we are, 60 years later, 50 years later, they're aging. They are requiring a ton of work. And so now we have to prioritize which impoundments are the most important. Which dikes do we need to riprap? Which ones do we need to fix? Which ones can we abandon? And again, that's always a tough issue, because our biologists, they're sitting there like, this is where I've worked for the last 20 years. I really like this wetland. It's really important. Or, it's just the public. I go out here to look at right-winged blackbirds. I go out here to see things. We understand that, but we also have to say, where can we put the amount of money that we have and resources to ultimately make sure that the habitat is good and it's benefiting what we had identified as priority species. And so using that decision support tool has been really important in terms of our justification, because again, as soon as we say we're going to abandon a wetland, some decision maker, some legislator is going to be getting a ton of phone calls from somebody that said, no, you can't do this. But we have a decision support tool that has all of the information available to us that says, we know that it's important to you, but ultimately it's not the most important wetland on the landscape. And so again, that's been one of the big ones that we as a department have been using over the last handful of years. So I'm just going to go through a handful of slides here in terms of how we've used this. This is just one example in Dodge County where we saw that this dike was failing. And so we were able to identify that this, again, if you guys recall, Dodge County was all Huck 9 or Huck 12 watersheds of 9. So again, it's a really important area across the state in terms of breeding waterfowl. So this was one where we put in a culvert and rip-wrapped all the dike. This is a perfect example of what a bad wetland looks like and what it could absolutely look like. And so the picture on the left is reed canary grass. It's probably really wet, but isn't very productive for waterfowl. Go in there, do some management, and that wetland on the right is going to be covered in multiple species of waterfowl for both spring and fall migration. And then this one was a ditch plug project with Ducks Unlimited, with the Department of Natural Resources, with NRCS, and again, we had to have buy-in from all of those entities to say, we need your money, we need our money, we need engineering help from Ducks Unlimited to do this. And by using the decision support tool, everyone had bought in and said, yep, that this is, again, limited resources. This is where we should be doing a lot of our work. And ultimately, this is now an awesome wetland in Jefferson County. So again, before I wrap her up and do questions here, I just wanted to toot Wisconsin's horn again on this one, in that I've gone through the entire history of it. I've gone through all the work of this. And again, Wisconsin is the only state that has done this. We are the only state that stepped down this, created our own decision support tool, and we have done presentations like this to other federal agencies, to other state groups, and there's increasing interest for other states to try to take advantage of this because the data's out there. Most of this data is available. It's more or less, can you get enough people in the room to collaborate with you to say, we're going to create something and abide by it. That's the biggest one. We wanted to make sure that we created a conservation strategy and a support tool that is not just going to sit on a shelf. Because unfortunately, that's what happens with a lot of management plans, a lot of habitat management plans, species management plans, is you do a ton of work, you put it away, and you say, well, we try to do a lot of that work, but due to funding or due to staffing, we can't do anything. That was not the case with this. We said this is going to be the decision-making tool for us to say where we're going to spend our money and ultimately how we're going to benefit waterfowl and habitat. So with that, willing to take any questions. Yes, sir.
So I got two.
Yep.
The first one is in regards to the priority watersheds versus kind of your Ebird overlay.
Yep.
How are you guys, or it might not be UW-DNR, but maybe it's Ebird, kind of weighing different areas in terms of sighting. So like you're obviously going to get a crap ton of sightings around like Milwaukee, and you're getting way less sightings up in the northern portion of the state. So like how are you weighing that with priority watersheds?
Fortunately, the folks at Cornell do all of that. Yeah, I don't know absolutely how the interior guts of their modeling or everything that they do there, but yeah, they essentially identify the individuals that they have essentially validated or have the most faith in, and yeah, recognizing that it's standardized essentially across rather than just saying, oh yeah, we're going to focus all of this on here. Like you said, it would be Madison. That would be where a ton of people are. We're seeing Kenosha, wherever those folks, or Meade. A lot of people travel from across the state and say all of a sudden this is a really big important area, but they're able to essentially standardize that across.
Okay, cool.
And your second question?
Yeah, the second one is how are you seeing, so since Wisconsin has kind of implemented this priority watershed thing, how have you guys seen waterfowl numbers change based on your management actions?
So again, fortunately and unfortunately, we look at waterfowl in terms of trends. So again, I would say that since we've implemented this, I would say over the last 4 years, I would be hesitant to say that anything that we've done has made a huge difference, just again, because just when we fund the project, say 4 years ago, there's still probably 20% of those projects that haven't even been done yet, just because a super warm winter, well, all of a sudden we can't get any equipment out there to do any management or anything along those lines. But we, as a department, it's one of our new research priorities, is we have spent millions of dollars on habitat funding, and we have done very little in terms of post-monitoring of that habitat. Whether we're talking pheasants, whether we're talking turkeys, whether we're talking, again, we rely on our biologists that says, oh yeah, this absolutely worked, and we trust that. But again, the question will come up from decision makers that says, okay, well, if we were to increase the duck stamp price, how many more ducks could you produce? And we don't really have a good way to say that because we don't do any post-management monitoring. And so we're going to really be working on that moving forward of saying, all right, well, we are now raising the water level, or we've done something, more soil management. All right, we have seen a 60% increase in migrating waterfowl on this thing. Okay, that's something that we can start putting a dollar value to and ultimately saying, okay, if you do this type of management, it's going to result in X in most cases. So yeah, that's one of our next steps.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep.
Any questions online?
Yep, Dr. Riddle.
So I'm assuming the eBird data is a lot of, kind of presence absence, that, somebody's seen the species here or there.
Yep.
And we've got, well, all three of the students were undergrads last year when they started this, but some of them have graduated now. They had a project where they used breeding bird atlas data to look at some habitat characteristics with loons.
Okay.
And then the breeding bird atlas data, there's kind of like 4 levels of presence. I think it's like observed, possible, probable, and confirmed.
Yep.
And confirmed is like, oh yeah.
The good stuff. Yep.
We saw a brood, on this lake or something. And anyway, they've actually submitted that for publication, and it's in review at the moment.
Okay.
But have you all considered also incorporating something like breeding bird atlas data that has these like different levels of kind of certainty or confidence and breeding output? I
would have to check with Jason and those folks that use this, as, that's everything that they do in terms of wetland ecology and stuff like. I haven't myself, but I wouldn't be surprised if that hasn't come up.
Cool.
Yep.
Well, if they haven't,
Yep. All right.
We should send this to you.
Sounds good. No,
I think it's got some
I-
cool applications.
I will definitely carry that to the folks, because like I said, we're making a concerted effort to update that, because as I said, all models are wrong, just some less so, so.
Yeah, it was an awesome talk. I really appreciate the balance of kind of people power and other quantitative information that's going into.
Yeah, I can, and again, the discussions at these, so it's great to have collaboration, but not everybody sitting at the table necessarily has the same thought process. So I can tell you that certain groups, potentially Wisconsin Waterfowl Association, said, well, we need to focus more on hunters and less on ecological goods and services. Because again, their constituent base is that group, and they're like, well, if somebody's flooded out, I'm not too worried about it, from their group's perspective. But, us as biologists, well, all of a sudden if some farm's flooded because we've done some type of management, we're going to hear about it. So again, it's one of those things that we have to consider. And it was, like I said, making sure that we had buy-in from all of the groups on this, and the fact that they have accepted this as the tool moving forward is huge, because if one group doesn't accept it, the whole thing falls apart. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You were talking about the 4 local species for waterfowl.
Yep.
Are you trying to increase the population as a whole, or like hens or drakes more?
We would increase the populations as a whole, but just recognizing that if we're improving breeding habitat, it's primarily going to be for hens. But again, if you're improving fall migration or spring migration, it doesn't really matter. It's whatever is going to be landing there. But ultimately, to grow a population, you need more hens. And that's where we're ideally focusing on, just recognizing that it's hard to be a hen for waterfowl. They have to do a lot of work, whereas drakes only have to do one thing. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could elaborate a little more regarding Amanda's work saying, maybe I misheard, but in terms of production metrics for pairs more so than broods, or assuming that more pairs will lead to more broods because she found less broods on those priority watersheds.
Yeah, I guess my thought process on this is over, a couple-year project, you could have a really good wetland that's very productive not be productive because all of a sudden it was washed out. You had a high rain event, or a handful of predators were there this year that weren't there last year. So I think necessarily using production on a short-term study like that is a little bit tougher just because your sample size is so small. Whereas with breeding pairs, and you show that that's a thing, whether they're successful or not successful, there's always the option it could be a sink. But in most cases, if we think it's a high quality wetland and birds are using it, I'm going to guess that more times than not, they'll be productive there. And that was kind of what I was trying to make a point of. Yes?
Why we talked about that there was the 4 focal species. Why those 4 species?
Just, again, they're the highest other than Canada geese, and we're not worried about making habitat for Canada geese. They are the highest productive ducks that we have in the state of Wisconsin. So again, those are the ducks, the species that we produce the most of.
Can I ask a follow-up
Yep.
question? So by making habitat for those species, does it benefit other duck species that breed here?
And that was something also that we really wanted to look at. You got mallard and teal. Mallard, they typically will come back to the same spot. If they're successful, they hone back into the same spot. Teal will go wherever there's good habitat. So again, we've actually seen an increase in teal over the last 5 years in Wisconsin because the prairies have been dry. And even no matter when Wisconsin's dry, we're wet compared to the prairies and when they're actually dry. So we got 2 different puddle ducks that behave differently. Then we have wood ducks, which again nest completely different than anything else. And then ringnecks are our diver guild that we can try to manage for. So again, we felt other than we were trying to incorporate canvasbacks, and again, we just don't produce a lot of canvasbacks, but they're very important in terms of migration. But we felt we had the best data available for those 4. And it felt that across the gambit that we covered the majority of different guilds or types of waterfowl that we could benefit. Well, again, I want to thank you all for having me as part of this. And again, if you guys have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out.